Hello everyone and welcome. I'm excited to kick off today's presentation with you. We'll be exploring Mega Goal 2.2, specifically Unit 10, titled, You Are What You Eat. In this session, we'll dive into the fascinating world of form, meaning, and function of various foods. Over the next few slides, I'll guide you through key concepts that help us understand how what we eat influences our bodies and health. So let's get started and enjoy the journey ahead. Let's take a closer look at nouns and specifically focus on whether they are countable or uncountable. On this slide, you'll see the word plural written twice and then singular. This is to illustrate how nouns change form depending on whether we are talking about one item or multiple items. For example, 3 pens shows the plural form, while 1 pen is singular. When we're talking about countable nouns, these are nouns that we can actually count. For instance, 1 carrot, 2 carrots, and so on. They have clear singular and plural forms, which makes it easier to quantify them. Now, the key point here is understanding the difference between countable and uncountable nouns. Countable nouns can be counted individually, which means they have both singular and plural forms. This is important because it affects how we use them in sentences. In the context of our overall theme, understanding these differences helps us communicate more accurately and clearly when talking about quantities. So, remember, countable nouns are those we can count, and they change form depending on whether we're talking about one or more. Today, I want to talk about some important points regarding nouns. First, notice that they don't use or and with these nouns, and they don't have plural forms. This means that words like water, sugar, and milk are uncountable, or non-count nouns. Some nouns, however, can be used as either count or non-count, depending on the context. For example, you can say a salad or some salad, and a soup or some soup. It all depends on whether you're talking about a specific item or an indefinite amount. Uncount nouns are things you can't easily count individually, like rice or tea. You wouldn't say 1 rice or 2 teas, but rather, you might say a grain of rice or a cup of tea. So, the key difference between countable and uncountable nouns is that countable nouns can be numbered and have a plural form, like apples or cars. Uncountable nouns, on the other hand, refer to substances or concepts that are difficult to separate into individual units. Recognizing this distinction helps us use the correct articles and quantifiers, which is essential for clear communication. This understanding is a fundamental part of mastering English nouns, and it ties into the overall theme of how we use language accurately and effectively. All right, let's look at our first example. He did some exercises in the gym. Now, notice here we're using the word some with a positive sentence. Some is often used when we're talking about an unspecified amount of something, especially in affirmative statements. It works with both plural countable nouns, like exercises, and uncountable nouns, like bread. Now, moving to the next example. There are some bread on the table. Here again, we use some because we're talking about an uncountable noun, bread, in a positive context. It's important to remember that some helps us refer to an indefinite quantity, and it's mostly used with positive sentences. Finally, a quick note on some versus any. In positive sentences, some is the go-to choice, especially when referring to plural countable nouns or uncountable nouns. This helps us communicate that we're talking about an unspecified amount, without focusing on the exact quantity. This concept ties into the overall theme of understanding how to use these words correctly in different contexts. Now let's look at how we use some with uncountable nouns. For example, if I want to offer someone a drink, I might say, "What about some juice?" Or, "Would you like some coffee?" Here, some is used to refer to an unspecified amount of an uncountable noun. It's important to remember that some is often used in questions when we're making offers or suggesting something. Like in this case, "Would you like some coffee?" It sounds friendly and polite, right? Now, a quick note about some versus any. We typically use some in positive sentences and offers, especially with uncountable nouns. This slide highlights that some is common in questions when you're offering or requesting, which is a little different from using any. So to sum up, some helps us talk about uncountable things in a flexible way, especially when making offers or asking politely. It's a small word but plays a big role in smooth, natural conversations. Now, let's look at how we use the word any in different situations. First, in questions, we often use any to ask about the existence of something. For example, you might ask, "Do you have any pens?" Notice here, because we're asking a question about pens, which are countable nouns, we use any. Next, any is also used with uncountable nouns when we're asking questions. For instance, is there any juice in the fridge? Again, we're inquiring if some juice is present, even if we're not specifying a particular amount. Moving to negative sentences, any is used to indicate the absence of something. For example, there isn't any milk in the fridge. This means there is no milk at all, emphasizing the negative. A key point to remember is that any is typically used with plural countable nouns and uncountable nouns, especially in questions and negatives. Now let's compare some and any. Some is used mainly in positive sentences when talking about an indefinite amount, like, "I have some pens." But as we've seen, any is preferred in questions and negatives. So in summary, any helps us ask about or deny the existence of something, whether it's countable or uncountable, and it's especially useful in questions and negative sentences. Understanding this distinction helps us communicate more naturally and accurately in English. So when we talk about the word some, it generally refers to an unspecified amount or number of something. It's often used in positive statements or offers, like, "I have some ideas," or "Would you like some coffee?" Moving on to any, this word is more flexible and is typically used in questions or negative sentences. For example, "Do you have any questions?" or "I don't have any free time today." It's a way of asking about or negating the existence of something without specifying a quantity. Now both some and any help us communicate about quantities that aren't exact, which is really useful in everyday conversations. But what's important to remember is that some is usually used in positive contexts, while any is used more in questions and negatives. Next, the word like can serve as a verb, meaning to enjoy or prefer something. For example, "I like this idea." It helps us express preferences or feelings about things. Then we have would, which is often used for polite requests or hypothetical situations, like, "Would you help me?" or "I would go if I had time." It adds a layer of politeness or possibility. Finally, order can refer to arranging items or giving instructions. For example, "Place your order at the counter," or "I want to order a pizza." All these words connect to our overall theme of understanding how to communicate quantities, preferences, and actions effectively in English. They are small words, but play a big role in making our conversations clearer and more natural. Let's take a look at the difference between uncountable and countable nouns when we want to talk about quantities. For uncountable nouns like sugar, we often use a little to express a small amount. For example, I might say, "I need a little sugar in my tea." This shows that I want some sugar, but not a lot, and sugar is uncountable, so we use a little. On the other hand, with countable nouns such as apples, we use a few to indicate a small number. For instance, "There are a few apples in the fridge." This means there are some apples, a small quantity, and apples are countable, so we say a few. It's important to remember that a little is used with uncountable nouns, and a few is used with countable nouns. This distinction helps us communicate more precisely in English. Now, a helpful tip is to think of a little as a positive idea. It suggests there is some, enough for what we need. Similarly, a few also conveys a positive, small quantity. This is useful when you want to emphasize that you have just enough of something, whether it's countable or uncountable. So, to connect this to our overall theme, mastering these small differences in quantity expressions can really improve your fluency and clarity when speaking or writing in English. Now, let's talk about the difference between uncountable and countable nouns. On this slide, you'll see the terms uncountable and countable. These are categories we use to classify nouns based on whether we can count them or not. For example, in the sentence, there is a lot of sugar in the kitchen. Sugar is an uncountable noun because you can't really count individual grains of sugar easily. You just measure or refer to it in bulk. On the other hand, in there are a lot of students in the class, students are countable because you can count each individual student. Now, a key point here is that the phrase, a lot of, can be used with both countable and uncountable nouns. It's quite versatile. And this leads us to the related expressions, a lot of and enough. These phrases are useful because they help us talk about quantities, whether we're counting items or measuring uncountable things. So remember, a lot of works with both types of nouns, making it a very flexible expression in everyday conversation. Let's talk about how we use enough with different types of nouns. First, notice that enough can be used with both uncountable and countable nouns. For example, if I say, there isn't enough sugar in the kitchen, I'm using sugar, which is uncountable. It means I don't have enough of that substance. On the other hand, I might say, I eat enough cookies, where cookies are countable nouns. This shows that I have a sufficient amount of cookies to feel satisfied. Now, the key point here is that enough can be used with both kinds of nouns to express sufficiency. Whether it's a substance you can't count individually, like sugar, or individual items you can count, like cookies, enough works the same way. Additionally, you'll often see a lot of and enough used to describe quantities. A lot of is more informal and means a large quantity, while enough emphasizes that the quantity is sufficient for a particular need or purpose. So remember, enough is flexible and versatile. It can describe both uncountable and countable nouns, helping us express whether we have enough of something or not. Let's talk about the word positive today. When we use positive in a sentence, it often indicates something that is affirming or in a good direction. Now, here's an important point. Much is never used in a positive or affirmative sentence. For example, we wouldn't say, I much like this. Instead, we say, I like this, or I really like this. But when it comes to countable nouns, we do use many. For example, there are many dogs in the class, or there are many students in the class. So, many is used in positive, affirmative sentences with countable nouns. This leads us to a key distinction. Many versus much. Remember, many is used with countable nouns in positive sentences, while much is used with uncountable nouns. So, to summarize, in positive sentences, many is common when talking about countable things, like dogs or students, and much is generally avoided in affirmative sentences, especially when referring to uncountable nouns. This understanding helps us form correct and natural-sounding sentences. Let's take a look at how we use negative with uncountable nouns. When we want to express that we don't have much of something, we use much in negative sentences. For example, I might say, I don't have much money. Here, money is uncountable, and much helps us convey that the amount is small or insufficient. Similarly, if there isn't much rice in the kitchen, I would say, there isn't much rice. Again, rice is uncountable, and much is the appropriate word to express a small quantity. Now, a key point to remember is that much is primarily used with uncountable nouns when forming negative sentences. This is different from many, which is used with countable nouns. So, in summary, much is used with uncountable nouns in negatives to emphasize that the quantity is limited or small. For example, there isn't much water, or I don't have much time. This distinction between much and many is important as we work on improving our language skills, especially when expressing quantity in negative sentences. Now let's look at how we ask questions about quantities using uncountable and countable nouns. First, we have uncountable nouns, which refer to things that we can't count individually, like water, rice, or information. When we want to ask about the amount of these, we use how much. So, for example, how much water do you drink a day? On the other hand, we have countable nouns, which are things we can count, like books, pens, or students. When asking about these, we use how many. For example, How many books are in the library? It's important to notice the difference. How much is used with uncountable nouns, and how many is used with countable nouns. This is a key point because it helps us ask the right questions depending on the noun type. Now there's also a comparison to keep in mind. How many versus how much. The first is for countable nouns, and the second for uncountable nouns. Understanding this distinction helps us communicate more clearly and accurately when inquiring about quantities. So, in summary, remember, uncountable nouns take how much, and countable nouns take how many. That way, your questions will always be grammatically correct and easy for others to understand. Let's take a closer look at this example. Sequence words are really helpful because they guide us through the order of events in a text. Think of words like first, next, then, and finally. These are the clues that tell us what happens first and what follows. By understanding these words, we can follow the story or process more easily and accurately. They're essential tools in helping us make sense of information, especially when we're trying to understand how things connect over time. Connecting this idea back to the overall theme, recognizing sequence words improves our comprehension and makes reading more engaging and clear. Finally, I want to wrap up by highlighting the importance of understanding the sequence of events. First, we look at what happens initially, setting the stage for everything that follows. Then, we see how things develop over time, leading to specific outcomes. Before reaching the final results, it's crucial to recognize the steps that lead us there. After all, these sequences help us grasp the cause-and-effect relationships within our process. Remember, before making decisions or implementing changes, understanding the prior steps is key. And after completing each phase, we can assess what worked and what needs adjustment. By paying attention to this flow, first, then, before, after, we can better manage projects and ensure smoother transitions. This overall perspective ties everything together and underscores the importance of strategic planning throughout the entire process.